Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Tom, we're back for another podcast. We're virtual once again, although I'm hoping this is the last one of these for a while. I'm planning on hitting the road and making my way back to Denver in the next day or two, and I've got about 1,700 miles ahead of me.
You've been a traveling man, Dave. You've been on the road for a long time.
It's been interesting. It's been interesting being away from Denver. I forgot about my feelings about humidity. I know you love it. You love the hot, humid weather. It's not my favorite thing. But I've also heard it's been a monsoon in Denver recently. So it'll be interesting to come back and see what the weather's like. But looking forward to getting back, getting settled back into town, seeing everybody. It's been a while since I've seen a lot of our members and our friends. And it'll be fun to see what comes next.
We miss you. You got to come home.
I'm gonna get there. Let's hope that monsoon doesn't cross me in the middle of the country, and I've got to drive through a bunch of flooding. But it should be a nice drive. I'll listen to a couple of books and go that way. Any suggestions of books on tape I should be listening to?
You know, I've never gotten into I've tried a couple of times to listen to books, and I know it's very popular. I know a lot of people do it. I know a lot of people who do it. I'm very slow in my reading habits. When I read things, I like to have a pen with me. I like to sit there and write up in the margins and make notes and underline things. I have a whole little system of underlines and triangles and circles that indicate like what's sort of important and what's medium important and what's really important. And I can't do that when I listen. And maybe I should. Maybe my problem was I've tried listening to serious intellectual type of books. Maybe if I just listened to fictional stories or something, that would be better. I don't know. So I'm not the right guy to ask. I've never gotten into the books on tape.
It would be a really interesting thought experiment or conversation with some people to find out if authors today are writing designed for audio more often. And I say that I decided on my way out here and then the various trips to Nashville, I was bouncing around sort of the Southeast and Midwest most of this summer. And I was listening to a lot of books on tape. And one of the things I noticed was some books, even I stayed in the same general genre of books. I wanted to go back and do the classics from growing up that I read in middle school and high school that I could come away with a very different perspective of now having the background and knowledge I have in my 40s that I did not have in my teens. And I'm talking about books like 1984, Animal Farm, Brave New World, a lot of those. Some translated to audio very, very well. Others were just brutal to listen to. Brave New World was, I still think it's a great read. I tried listening to it. It was not a good audiobook. Animal Farm, on the other hand, was phenomenal by audio. 1984 was phenomenal by audio. It's just a style of writing that sometimes it comes across really well and sometimes it doesn't. And I wonder how often authors are thinking about that today in our new space.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned this. I mean, I have a couple of related questions I've always wondered about. And again, it's never having really gotten into that whole mode of absorbing books. Is the amount that typical listeners absorb comparable to a reader? Like if one person listens to a book and someone else reads a book, are they remembering? Are they getting the same, having the same kind of experience? I'm not really, I don't know about that.
It's interesting
to know.
Yeah, there's some books that I found that I had to find an audiobook version. You and I have talked at length about Ben Franklin's autobiography.
Sure.
I tried reading that and I kept coming across acronyms and abbreviations. He used abbreviations throughout that I wasn't familiar with at all. I think they were shorthand in the 1700s, 1750s, 1760s that we just don't use anymore. and I would clearly not understand an entire section of the book. I went back and I found the audiobook that accompanies the reading, and I read along with the audiobook, and they would actually say what the abbreviation was, and it made it a whole lot more. It allowed me to understand so much more of that book, but I still had the book in front of me. So if I wanted to make notes, if I wanted to highlight anything or call anything out, it was there right in front of me. But somebody was actually helping me through the areas I didn't know. Then we've also talked about, go ahead.
Well, I've also wondered, like, how important is the voice that's reading the book? I imagine that's has to count for something, right? If it's there's a basic level, is it pleasing to listen to? Is it not pleasing to listen to? But also the pace that they read at.
Yeah.
Do they speak in a different tone of voice when they're trying to mouth the words of different characters, for example? Do they make their voice sound different or not? Does that help intellectually, like setting it off? I don't know. A lot of interesting questions there.
It's a good point. You think about people who can do accents. That was something I noticed in Animal Farm. The reader could do accents for the different animals. So some of them had British accents, some of them didn't, some of them had something else altogether. It was kind of interesting. There was one other thing that I found. I did the audiobook of a book called Can't Hurt Me that was written by a military vet named David Goggins. And I learned about this through the Joe Rogan podcast. David Goggins was the first, I want to get this right, and I hope I do, was the first person ever to graduate from Army Ranger School, Navy SEAL School, and Air Force Paratrooper School, all to finish all three of those programs.
Yeah.
And this guy has taken, embraced the pain to another level.
Right.
His favorite day of the year is the negative degree weather in Chicago, where he'll go out in shorts and no t-shirt in the snow in a blizzard and go run laps around Lakefront Avenue or Lakefront Drive or Lakeshore Drive, whatever it's called in Chicago, along the lake where it's coldest. And he's out there running because he says that the cold, actually, the pain drives him, the pain. And so this whole book is called Can't Hurt Me. Anyway, the point of why I brought this up was he actually had a ghostwriter. He admitted fully, he's like, I was not capable of writing this book on my own. I'm a military guy. I'm a workout guy. I'm not a writer. So it was actually really cool. The way they did the audiobook was they brought him into the studio with the reader, who was also his ghostwriter. And his ghostwriter read the book and would stop periodically and say, hey, when we were writing this book, you told me this other story and it didn't make it into the book itself.
Right.
But the audience should know it. Why don't you tell them that story? And so it was kind of half audiobook, half podcast. And it was really kind of a cool way to listen to something. So it is fun the way these things are evolving. And I'm hoping I can find one or two more for the 17 or 18 hours or so I have on the road ahead of me.
Well, let us know what you end up picking out and what kind of insights you get from it.
I will.
If it's anything that, teaches those in government to what a constitutional republic means, maybe we'll forward a copy to them.
What I could do is I could try to find the audiobook of the bill that they just passed that was supposed to be this Inflation Reduction Act that does absolutely nothing for inflation. I just wonder if I could finish the audio recording of that in the 17 hours in the car. It's probably so long.
This reminds me of a great story. This is a true story. When I was teaching as a professor at Hillsdale College, Congress was working on the what was it called? The Higher Education Reauthorization Act. And so this involved the Department of Education, all kinds of standards, the processes for like financial aid and what all of that meant, how a school would qualify, all these things. And so I'm there, I'm at Hillsdale, and of course, very good friends with Larry Arnn, the president. I had worked with him in Claremont and at Hillsdale, and there are several other interested people. And we decided we wanted to be able to comment firsthand on this piece of legislation. We're in a college, right? I'm teaching there. Dr. Arnn is the president. And so we got a copy of it. And we talked about this beforehand. We're like, we're smart guys, and we're all political scientists. We study politics and legislation. We can read this thing. None of us made it past a few pages. I mean, it was the most dreadful experience the way modern legislation is written. First of all, it's all these references. This piece refers to subsection, subletter E1 of this other document, right? So it's pointing to all these other places. If you don't have all that at your fingertips, you're sort of lost because you don't know what all those things are actually referring to. And it's written in a way that is openly hostile to ordinary citizens. It is not meant to be read by citizens, which in itself is a big problem. There is an entire industry.
Right.
There is a profession of people. If you get elected to the state legislature or to Congress, and suppose you have a good idea for a good piece of legislation, and you think there's a possibility of it getting passed, typically you don't sit down and write it up yourself. Oh, no. This is part of the administrative state. There are now experts who write that legislation. You tell them the main ideas you have, and then they transform that into the legalese that you typically find in legislation.
Right.
One of my favorite exercises as a political science professor, I would give students just a few pages of any big modern piece of legislation, and you could take your pick. It doesn't matter. Obamacare or the Higher Education Reauthorization Act, or any of these.
Anything that we have to pass first before we know what it says.
Yeah, any of these things. They're all big, and I'd give them just a few pages, and we would look at it and read a few sentences in class and talk about what could this possibly mean. And, and I would explain now the whole bill. These things are normally 1,000 pages, 2,000 pages, they're these big books if you actually print it out. And I would do that before assigning to them the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was one of the first laws passed by the first Congress. Among its interesting features, it stopped the spread of slavery to the Northwest Territory.
Right.
But the basic point I would make is, first of all, the whole Northwest Ordinance, it's 2 pages. The whole law is 2 pages. It is written in English. It not only is it readable, an ordinary person can read, it's actually kind of pleasing to read. There are passages in it that are a slightly poetic, that are, a little bit beautiful. And it's just a wonderful thing. And so to contrast, what legislation used to be, it used to be, first of all, older legislation used to be on a single topic. One bill would be about one subject. It would be written in language that is open and accessible to citizens. We wanted citizens to read legislation and actually be familiar with it, be able to discuss it and debate it. And it was enjoyable. Now, legislation is just this imposing, daunting, only a handful of people can even understand what's in those things, which just shows how far removed we've come from anything resembling a self-governing republic, a constitutional republic. Not only do we, the citizens, not know what's in our legislation, our legislators don't know what's in the very legislation they're voting on. Many, many times they have no idea. How could they when they're presented with a bill that's 2,800 pages long and the vote's going to be tomorrow? Who can possibly make sense of that?
Right. Well, and I think that's the bigger point. And let's remember, this goes to the same thing we were talking about last week. This is the permanent government, right? These people who are there writing this legislation, it's not the legislators writing this, and the legislators don't hire the people themselves to write the legislation. These are people who are full time. This is their job, is to write legislation. They write it for both parties. They don't. It's not like it's not like the Republicans have this group and the Democrats have this group and Bernie Sanders has his person or whatever else it might be. This is just one group of people, permanent jobs, permanent government, who sit in the office all day, every day, and say, okay, we're going to control what all of these bills say, what all of these laws say, And the government's going to tell us, the legislators are going to tell us generally what they want to be in it. They're going to tell us what pork they want in there too. What are the extra things they want buried in this thing? And we're going to bury them appropriately. And we're also going to make sure that we reinforce all of the things that we need reinforced, because at the end of the day, those people don't answer to legislators. They should, but they answer to some other bureau somewhere else in government.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, just as a contrast here, I would invite our listeners to think about it. I'm not suggesting this is any sort of possibility. I just want people to understand what this means by giving a different perspective. There was this very small republic, the Icelandic Republic, hundreds of centuries ago, and it wasn't that long lived, but it was almost something of a kind of liberty or libertarian sort of paradise. It was a very minimal government. They had strict protections for property rights. There was a large degree of individual liberty woven in, and they had this interesting government official. His title was something like the law caller, something like that. It may be a slightly different name, but the point is, once a year, everyone in the community gathered, and the law caller audibly called out the laws. And if it was not spoken, then for the next year, it was not part of the laws. The laws were what could be known and memorized by a citizen. The idea being, if the laws are so numerous, so voluminous that citizens can't know them, right? Then what good is it having those laws? You have to be able to memorize them. They have to be understandable. They have to be able to, you have to be able to say them in a way that everyone around you can understand them. We're very much the opposite. And I mean, I'm glad you pointed that out, because it is this, in a way, it's emblematic of what our government has become. There are these professional, bureaucratic, unelected experts who actually write the legislation. This is something I haven't thought about that much, and I invite our listeners to think about this. What would happen if we passed one statute and we said, or maybe a constitutional amendment, and we said any piece of legislation has to be written by the member of Congress who's sponsoring it? Right. You want to propose a piece of legislation? You write it. Yeah. I suspect that alone would reduce the pieces of legislation each year.
You'd think so, but I would start to wonder about things like, okay, so now it's who can raise the most money to hire a team to do that, and you're going to start getting into all of this. I mean, it's going to get messy either way, and we've just gotten so far away from the basic ideas. And then the other question I'd have is, does it even matter? Does any of this legislation even matter? Because it's still all controlled by the permanent government. And if it doesn't pass by legislation, it's going to be written as some regulation by some bureaucrat somewhere. And that, Dave, you're touching on all the really important things here. We've raised this question. We've raised the question before on this podcast, and we're going to continue to raise it. Do elections matter? And we could add to it, do the laws matter? On the one hand, do elections matter? I mean, of course they matter in sort of the most immediate, superficial sense. If Joe Biden gets elected president, he becomes the next president. When Donald Trump was elected, yes, he was sworn in, and right. And so we do see a shifting of seats in government. Now, in the case of Congress, not nearly as much. Many seats in Congress, the incumbency rate for decades has hovered way up in the 90%, meaning everyone who runs for re-election, almost all of them win re-election. With very few exceptions. It is far more common now in Congress for members of Congress to either retire or die in office of old age than to lose an election, right? And get pushed out because they lost an election. To that point, real quick, to that point, I mean, we've had conversations with legislators before. We've asked, things about removing removing certain bureaucratic rules, removing ability to create regulations, even removing bureaucratic agencies. And they kind of laugh at us saying that, that's not really possible. I can't really do that. It's nice in theory and all, but I can't really do that. And for the most part, I think it's because most of them are told from the minute they get elected, just don't step on your own feet. Don't trip over your own feet, and you're just gonna keep getting reelected over and over and over again until you run into something like a Liz Cheney who decides to stand up and I think she was way off base, and I'm gonna be happy to see her gone. But Liz Cheney has been reelected over and over and over in Wyoming and had no trouble until she decided that she wanted to impeach Donald Trump, and that was basically the end of her. And so that's why you see a lot of these congressmen, these legislators saying, I'm not stepping out of the Overton window. I'm not going to do anything that really is questionable, because why would I? It's going to cause me to lose my election. It's going to cause me to get thrown out of Congress, and I don't want to do that. I think we just saw that potentially with Joe Manchin. It'll be interesting to see if Manchin gets reelected in I think he's up in 2 years, maybe 4 in the Senate. But most of these guys just will say, I don't want to step on my own feet. I don't want to be out there, and I don't want to.
You're right. Why do something really risky, right? Why do something very unusual? Why do something way outside the Overton window when if you just kind of stay quiet, you're guaranteed a really nice, cushy life. In fact, I was just looking just before we started recording here. I actually follow a lot of progressives and Democrats because I want to know what they're talking about. And I received this actually really nice looking big ad by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's a fundraiser that she sent out. And she's pointing out in there correctly how more than half of the members of Congress are millionaires. And yet, most of them, they really don't have any real work experience. They've never experienced what that's like to be working a job and worried whether you can make the house payment and the car payment and buy the groceries, right, and all those. Many of them have never experienced this, and yet they go on to become millionaires. How is it, right? They're not inventing the next smartphone or the next medicine, or they're not creating real wealth for themselves by producing value for others. They're getting wealthy through crony favoritism, right? What they can sell is they can sell access to government favors and perks and things like that.
But there is some irony of that coming from her. But
absolutely. And it wouldn't surprise me if she sticks around in Congress. She too will become a millionaire. But it was interesting, to see that coming from, because she's absolutely right about it. And it's all part of that problem, right? You elect someone and you're hoping they will be part of a team there in Congress that can really shake things up and start to change things, and they don't. And a year or two later, 5 years later, 10 years later, you're sitting there scratching your head thinking, why didn't they do anything? And the answer is, well, they got a really nice life if they really, don't do much at all. And in that sense, and I wanted to say there's a couple of the big points I want to make here, whether elections matter, whether laws matter. But you mentioned Liz Cheney, and I thought our listeners might find this interesting. I think you and I perhaps might differ a little bit on Liz Cheney. I'm not sure. There's part, I actually kind of agree with part of what Liz Cheney's been doing. I don't think Liz Cheney is entirely wrong. And here's what I mean by that. What happened on January 6th, right? It was a problem. It was a problem. And I too would, if I was in Congress, I would want to know what that was all about. Mm-hmm. And here's the rub, right? Is a lot of people watch what's going on. They say, well, that's simply political theater that Democrats have orchestrated. That's also true. That both things are true, right? It is political theater that Democrats are very much designing for a political purpose. And that was a shocking, startling, that was a big problem that day, the events of that day. I would want to know what happened too. And Liz Cheney, I know most, certainly most Republicans, certainly all Trump fans, right, loathe her and despise her. And yet she's doing something right now that's kind of unusual. She's proving the outlier in that whole model you just showed. Like, she didn't have to do that. She could have just kept her head down, kept quiet, probably have as a Republican from Wyoming, probably have a really long career. And, is she going to switch parties and become a Democrat? I don't know. Probably not. But she's made it really uncomfortable for herself within the Republican Party. But I wanted to make this bigger point about whether elections matter at all. And here's the big point.
Before you get into that, I want to just comment on a couple of things we just discussed. First of all,
sure.
This whole thing about sort of staying quiet and just letting things happen and letting the permanent government keep operating. To me, it's like being the backup quarterback on an NFL team, right? If you're sort of that permanent backup who never plays, you kind of have a lot of job security. You don't have to worry about it. You know the playbook. You're there just in case. But what has been a better job for anybody in terms of job security than the guy who got to be Peyton Manning's backup quarterback all those years, or the guy or the guys who got to back up Joe Montana, John Elway, right? You're not coming in. Nobody's calling for you to come in and play. You got a couple $1 million a year and you never had to do anything. And nobody had any expectations of you. Gary Kubiak, if Elway ever missed a game, most people just said, okay, we're going to get Gary Kubiak. He's going to be serviceable. We know he's not great, but he and Elway are really good friends, and Elway likes having him around. And so we're just going to keep him around the team. But there was never any expectations of him. And that was kind of that role. For some people who don't have this grand dream of doing something amazing, outstanding, they just want to be there and they want to play the role of politics. It's sort of the same thing. On the Liz Cheney point, just really quickly, because you and I do differ on that a little bit. I have a couple of theories on Cheney. I think she's really not all that interested in what actually happened on January 6th. I think her real motivation is Donald Trump called her father out repeatedly. I have several problems with the Bush-Cheney administration. And Donald Trump did too. It was something he and I very much agreed on. Yeah. And I think a lot of this is just the Liz Cheney revenge tour. And we are seeing one new thing in politics that we haven't seen until recent years. And the sports analogy plays really well here too. And that is, when people now exit politics, there are media jobs waiting for them. There are book deals waiting for them. Liz Cheney will have no trouble creating a second career for herself that 40 years ago, 30 years ago, that would not have been an option. Nobody was going to go hire Liz Cheney to be an anchor on a television show. Nobody was going to give her a book deal worth millions of dollars. They might have said, write a book and we'll see if it sells and go from there. But she's going to have book deals. She's going to make millions by filling this role. And so she didn't really have as much of a risk in going after this that she used to. And we should kind of keep that in mind as we watch what happens in politics in coming years.
It's a great point. And I think it simply expands, my point. I mean, all these things can be true. One can say January 6th was deeply troubling. We don't want that to happen. We don't want it to be worse. Next time there's a presidential election or transition. And so number one, people can be genuinely concerned and want to know what's going on. Number two, Democrats can be orchestrating that and using it for political theater for their own advantage. And Liz Cheney can be seeking revenge for Trump, going after her father. And she can be preparing for a career after politics. Like all those things can be true simultaneously. And that's probably, explains a lot of what's going on. But, the bigger point that I wanted to make, and sort of building off of our great conversation that we had last week, do elections matter? And here's what I mean by that. We now have a gigantic, unconstitutional bureaucracy. It consists of nearly 3 million unelected bureaucrats, and that does not include members of the military. So I'm not talking about right? Enlisted and officers in the Army and Navy and Air Force and Marines and Coast Guard. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the bureaucrats who work at the Department of Transportation, right, and TSA agents and the IRS and places like that, right? Sometimes you and I refer to it as the administrative state, that it's this big bureaucratic blob that claims to administer our lives, how we're going to run our affairs, use our property, educate our kids, things like this. And the question is it possible? Can an election significantly alter the administrative state? If the American people say, we're tired of this big unconstitutional administrative state, it's wasteful, it's expensive, it's counterproductive. It not only doesn't solve the problems it claims it's going to solve, it actually creates all kinds of new problems and makes things worse. It makes everything more expensive, everything more difficult. It fuels all kinds of corruption and cronyism, and we're done with it. We want to see it starting to be, we want to see entire bureaucratic agencies repealed and abolished. Can that happen? Is it possible after an election? And I pose it as a question. I don't know the answer. I kind of want our members thinking and talking about this. If the answer is yes, we really can. The bureaucratic administrative state it has not yet become a permanent government. We can actually knock parts out if we really have the resolve, the political, if we want to. Then that means we still are a self-governing nation to some degree. If the answer is no, these things they've been created and designed in a way, they're funded, they're designed legislatively to be largely immune from the effects of elections. That no matter who gets elected, doesn't matter which party controls Congress, the Department of Education isn't going anywhere. The IRS isn't going anywhere. If that's the case, then I would submit that elections don't really matter. It can't alter the form of government that we have. And in a way, that's the most important thing that elections should be determining. What is our government going to be? And then closely related to that is the point you brought up. Do our laws matter? Do they really matter? This is where it's getting scary, Dave. We're entering a realm here where increasingly our government is lawless. Even if something is put into a statutory law, if the administration doesn't like it, there is no law. There is no law in the book that says we should have open borders. That's not a law. No, Congress has never passed that. In fact, there are laws in place that there should be procedures, there should be a vetting process, that the border should be controlled. But if an administration wants open borders by executive orders and regulations and just practice the way they implement it, right? They can choose what laws to enforce and what laws to ignore. And you basically can have de facto open borders, which is more or less what we've had since Biden came in as president. There is no law in the book that says the IRS shall be used as a political partisan organization to go after conservatives. That's not the law. In fact, the law says the IRS is going to be neutral, right? And going to be politically neutral and treat all citizens and all organizations in a manner that is accordance with equal protection of the law. Yet in practice, right, if an administration wants to use the IRS to start targeting political opponents, they do it. And so in that sense, to a large degree, I would argue in modern progressive America today, it's a question whether elections matter. And I would argue to a large extent, laws don't actually matter.
I'm going to use your phrase. I'm going to put a sharper edge on that.
Yeah.
We talked at the beginning. I'm heading back to Denver tomorrow. And I will tell you, most of our listeners know this. I went through some robbery problems before I left. My garage was broken into twice, and then my car, somebody broke the back window of my car and broke in and stole a lot from me in my car. There is a lack of enforcement of those laws, the very basic laws that we have on our books. The primary purpose of government is the protection of private property of citizens. That is the foundational purpose of the law. And we have governments around the country, state governments, county governments, local municipalities saying, we're not enforcing those laws. We're not helping there. And if you're going to talk about, if they're not going to do that, then laws really don't matter. Because I'll tell you this, if they're not going to protect my private property, why am I even paying taxes? What is the whole purpose of this? Yeah. If you need 87,000 new IRS agents to do what? You're not doing any of the primary purposes of what government is supposed to do. So what are you raising money for? And then we start to see the things that they're putting money into and how much more expensive everything is getting. And it just doesn't make sense. And at some point, we as citizens have to stand up and ask, you need 87,000 IRS agents for what? What do you need all this money for if you're not going to do the primary job that you're elected to do?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. In fact, it's in a way it's turning the whole model of a constitutional republic onto its head. The idea that came out of the founding was the political realm, the arena of politics. That will be the arena where citizens are talking, debating, maybe fighting and arguing, promoting their interests, their agendas, whatever they are. One of the examples the founders used in the Federalist Papers, Madison uses different religions as just an example of how this works. He makes the argument that what you want is a large nation with many people and many different religions. And so in the political realm, right, you have Catholics talking about their interests, and you have Methodists, and you have Lutherans, and you have, right, and early on, right, groups of Jews start coming to the United States, and you have within Judaism, you have all these different factions. You have Orthodox and conservatives, and right now, and if you have a whole bunch of them, they're talking and debating and fighting about political matters, public matters, matters of public policy and things like this, right? And then they have elections and they elect representatives. And those representatives in government are supposed to represent all those interests of those different people who elected them. Same thing with other types of interests, non-religious, right? So you're going to have among the citizens, you're going to have farmers, and you're going to have manufacturers, and right, and you're going to have fishermen, and people have different economic types of interests. You're going to have rich people, you're going to have poor people, you're going to have middle class people, older people, younger people, right? All kinds of differences, debating, discussing what policy should be, what the United States should do, and then those interests get represented in government. And the primary purpose of government is to protect all the rights of all those different people, all of them. What is the one group that is not supposed to be in politics, that has no business being in, is government.
No, right.
Government is not supposed to be down there in the realm. It's not an interest to be represented in the political realm. And one of the problems with the creation of a big administrative bureaucratic state, the single, hands down, single largest employer in the United States is the federal government. Right. No other organization comes anywhere close to employing as many people as the federal government. The problem with that is the administrative state has become a player in our politics. They have their own interests, just like Methodists have interests and farmers have interests, right? And bankers have interests. The bureaucratic class, they have their interests, but there's one big difference. All those other groups, right? Christians and Jews and old people and young people and people who live on the coast and people who live inland, all those different groups. The one thing they cannot do, any of them, they can't use the power of government to hurt their political opponents and help their political friends because they're not in government. They're just regular citizens. But the administrative state, it can do all sorts of things, right? It can submit affidavits. It can get subpoenas. It can get the FBI to raid I can't get the FBI I can't order the FBI to raid anybody. Suppose we're both competing in an election, Dave. You and I are running for the same office, right, against each other. One thing I can't do, I can't order the FBI to raid your house. You can't order the FBI, right? But if I'm the Justice Department, I absolutely can order the FBI to raid your house. And so they can do all these things. They can charge people with crimes. They can leak information. I mean, I mentioned last week, and I think it's worth repeating, going all the way back to Watergate. This is one of the main ways the administrative state engages in politics is they leak information to their friends in the press. And of course, their friends in the press are all too happy to run with that. I mean, all these things from Iran-Contra to the Bush administration to the Trump administration, all these things, these leaks, where these leaks come from? These leaks come from typically federal law enforcement agents, right? Either CIA or FBI. They're leaking the information to the New York Times. And they're all political acts. They're political actions meant to shape the next election cycle, meant to shape public policy, whether they're for something or against something. And I would argue this is our great crisis today, is our government no longer represents the interests of citizens. Our government is concerned first and foremost with promoting its own interests, its own well-being in the political realm.
Well, and what's even more disturbing and what goes along with everything you just said is you talked about all of those representatives coming together and discussing, right? The person who's representing this group of people and a person who's representing this group of people, them all coming together and them discussing. Those people, those are the legislators, those elected legislators all have a ceiling on how much they can do, which is defined by the Constitution. There's only so much that they're allowed to do. They can't go and just say, you know what? The majority of us think this is what the law should be. So that's what the law is going to be. If it's unconstitutional, if it's saying, you know what, there's a lot more Methodists in this world than anybody in this country than anybody else. So we're going to say that Methodist is the official religion of this country. The Constitution says, no, you can't do that. We don't really care if a majority of you want that. You can't do it.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, right? There's a prohibition, makes it real clear. It doesn't matter if a gigantic majority wants the thing. The Constitution says, no, you can't do that.
Now, the bureaucrats, on the other hand, the permanent government, the administrative state, the progressives that we've been talking about, they don't even have to participate in those conversations. And that's where this gets really scary, right? It's not like, okay, now you also have this bureaucracy that is also representing all these government employees, and they're going to go participate in this conversation, and they're going to participate in elections and voting on legislation, and they're going to be governed by the Constitution. They're saying, no, we live in this world up here outside of the Constitution, outside of the rules of government. And if you don't like what we're doing, we're just going to put more rules and regulations on you. We're going to create a story, or we're going to bring up some violation of the law that you committed that leads to something like Donald Trump's house getting raided, or Watergate, or any of the other things that have happened in between. I brought this up last week. We have had an impeachment attempt based on some claim of violation of a regulation, not necessarily a law, but a regulation on every single Republican president since Eisenhower. At that point, you just know that they're sitting there and they're saying, we don't really care what the Constitution says. We don't really care what the people want. We're here to know what's best. We're here to take care of what we think is best, and we're going to do whatever we want to do. And you really don't get a say in any of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want to make sure this is clear what we're saying for our listeners. Let's go back. I kind of like this idea of setting up a hypothetical. You and I, we're running against each other. We're both. Let's just say we're both running for president of the United States. Okay. And we are political opponents. Now, here's what the administrative state will allow. You and I can debate something that's outside of government, climate change. We can differ, and I can say I have a $2 trillion program that's going to solve the climate change, and you can come along and say you have a $5 trillion plan that's going to solve the climate problem.
You're going to throw that on me? Somebody's going to come back to me and say, hey, I heard you had a $5 trillion plan to save climate change. You're a terrible person.
And you see what from the administrative state, they're okay because they win. No, whether you win that election or I win that election, they're getting more money, more resources, more power, more control over people's lives, right? They win no matter what. So they're perfectly. They say candidate Tom, candidate Dave, you guys go fight your butts off over climate change and other problems out there in the world. The one thing they will not tolerate is if we turn to them and we say they're the problem. The bureaucrats, the administrative state, and you and I start debating how many of those bureaucracies should we repeal, should we get rid of. That's a kind of politics they don't want to happen. That is their worst nightmare. And so the moment someone in the political realm makes the administrative state the subject of their politics, the administrative state hits back. And we I mean, the great example, I used to use Nixon as the primary example, but Trump went through something even Nixon didn't go through. I mean, from the minute he started talking about the swamp this is even before he was elected, all kinds of leaks are going out, right? This is the administrative state. And then when he wins the election, which nobody thought could actually happen, I do think even the bureaucratic class was sort of caught by surprise.
Yes.
Like they didn't actually think he was going to win. And all of a sudden, holy cow, here's this guy who says in public that we bureaucrats are the problem. And so you see the bureaucratic state mobilize instantly. And from the night of the election, right, there's this ongoing, 3.5 year attempt to discredit that election and do everything that they could do so that it appeared that Trump wasn't actually a legitimately elected president, and try to undermine his credibility every step of the way. That's the scary thing about where we are, is when the administrative state sits there and decides they're going to be a player and they're going to decide who in the political world can appear credible and who in the political world is going to have their credibility destroyed. There's this other piece of all this. I don't know how well known this is, but it's hugely important. That big bureaucratic class, again, we're talking approximately, it's a little bit less than the numbers slightly fewer than 3 million unelected bureaucrats, right, most of whom have the power to issue and enforce regulations and run our lives. Those 3 million unelected bureaucrats, almost all of them at the federal level, are part of unions. They're part of public employee unions. So Dave, think about how this works. You pay taxes. The government takes some money from you in the form of taxes. They take some of that money and they use it to pay a salary to a bureaucrat who works at the IRS, even, which is perfectly poetic. That IRS employee, those 87,000 new ones, I guarantee they will all be part of unions. So your tax dollar just got paid to this bureaucrat at the IRS. He pays dues to this union. Guess what the union does with those dues? They go fund the campaigns of progressive Democrats who want to add 87,000 new employees to the IRS and other administrative agencies. They want to expand the administrative state. It is the grossest form of laundering. It's money laundering happening right in front of our eyes. The political Joe Biden or AOC or Elizabeth Warren or any of them, they know they can't come and just literally forcefully take your money and put it into their own campaigns. They can't do that. They can't make you fund their campaigns. But what they can do is they can make you fund the administrative state, and then the administrative state through the unions funds their campaign. It's just laundering theft from you and shoving that money right into their campaigns.
And the IRS union just doubled its budget. Literally just doubled its budget today or this week. Right. This week, the IRS's budget for campaign donations just doubled, and that's a scary stat. Now it's interesting you say all of that because it's all in the way it's positioned. Because what you just said can't happen just did in Colorado, and when it happened in Colorado, even the most leftist media, the most progressive media outlets start questioning it. When you do it directly, even the progressive media starts saying, wait a minute, we can't be that unbiased, or we can't be that biased, rather. We've got to stop this. So Jenna Griswold, who's the Secretary of State in Colorado, was just caught creating campaign ads essentially for her reelection. Now she's couching them in get out and register to vote. Right. But it's got her face all over it. It served as a campaign ad, and she was using tax dollars to fund those advertisements. And even Kyle Clark, who anybody in Colorado knows is no friend of anybody who believes in freedom. Kyle Clark even has called her out for it. However, if she had given that money to an election commission, and that election, because that's part of her job purview, and that election commission put that commercial out, but featured her, said, hey, Jenna, will you come up here in this? Because we want somebody who has the credibility of an elected official. And they ran the same exact commercial. He wouldn't have said a word. What's the difference? It's just the passing of money. And oh, by the way, there would have been some other hands greased along the way if that money had gotten spread around.
You couple these things. Well, there's actually a third piece that we should probably add into this. So you, on the one hand, you have, I guess I shouldn't use hands because I'm going to say three. We're going to have three hands. On the one hand, you have the bureaucratic class can use their powers to leak information, to harass candidates, to try to discredit candidates, or they can ignore, right? So if Hillary Clinton is the one finding herself in some hot water, what they do there is they don't do a raid, right? They don't go raid her house to try to help her maintain whatever credibility she has in the public eye. So they have those tools to act politically. Then you have the union money laundering scheme, in which virtually all of it is taking our tax dollars and using it to fund the campaigns of progressive Democrats who want to expand the administrative state. And then, of course, the other piece that you have of that is that political class who wants to expand the administrative state. They have a reach, they have an influence through the media that you and I don't have. Right. If you call a press conference today, Dave, how many reporters are going to show up? Probably not very many. But if a sitting president of the United States, if Joe Biden calls a press conference, right, or if a ranking member of Congress, if Nancy Pelosi calls a press conference, every major news outlet, not only in the country, in the world, they're going to show up. And so they have this huge megaphone to reach enormous numbers of people. You put those three things together and it forms a kind of juggernaut. And I go back to this question I've been raising now for many years. Do elections actually matter? Can they matter? Can they shake that all up? Can an election, just suppose for the sake of argument, large numbers of America spread out over many states, they said, we are tired of this expensive, unconstitutional, bureaucratic thing. We want it to go away. We want it much smaller. Start getting rid of some stuff. And they elected large numbers of Congress and a president. What would be the result? What would actually be the result? Would we see the elimination of some of these administrative bureaucratic agencies? And, that should be the goal. That should be the number one goal of every election. I wish more Republicans talked about this. I wish they were better at talking about these things, that our own government has inserted itself into politics. And that's a huge problem. And we got to start getting rid of that problem. But they don't talk about it. The few who do tend not to talk about it very well.
Well, we saw how hard it really is, because Trump did run on that in 2016. And not only did Trump get elected, but large numbers of members of Congress and the Senate got elected on supporting him and doing that. And for a short time, he did have that majority. and he was unable to effectively do virtually anything to shrink the administrative state. It took months and months and months just to get certain ideas out there and to get access to the information that he wanted in order to do it. And the administrative state pushed back in every way. And then they started to try to impeach him. And for some reason that we may never know, he backed off quite a bit of his drain the swamp conversation, to the point that we didn't even really hear that phrase in the 2020 election. And it seemed more than ever that he should have been standing up saying, you see what happens when I try to drain the swamp? They're coming at me with everything they have. They keep trying to impeach me. They keep trying to get rid of me. They're trying to make me look ridiculous. This is what happens when you try to do this. We need to keep working at it. Instead, he just dropped the conversation altogether. And so it makes you wonder what was happening behind those closed doors in the rooms we couldn't see, in the conversations we couldn't hear. What was happening to prevent him from doing that? And if a guy like Donald Trump is incapable of pursuing that, who is somebody who really doesn't care. I mean, I really don't think he cares if large numbers of people out there hate him, because he also knows large numbers of people out there loved him for it.
Right.
If he couldn't do it, who's going to?
Yeah,
who is going to be capable of actually doing that?
That's a great question. Another way to put it, just another angle. This might sound a little conspiratorial, but given the history of the FBI, this is very much the way they operate. What kind of dirt did they have on Trump?
Yes.
When they sat in a private room and they said, hey, Mr. Trump, Mr. President, we've got this dirt. Look at these photographs. Look at these videos. This will go public. This will go viral if you don't back off of us. And whatever they had, they'll do the same thing to the next person. Who, to your point, who's going to be more feisty than Donald Trump? He's pretty feisty. He seems to be pretty willing to mix it up, right, with those in government. And you're right. Even he backed down. Even he backed off, which makes me wonder, what did they have on him? And the point is, for decades, this became one of the central functions of the FBI. We talked last time that long period under J. Edgar Hoover, he specialized in this, collecting dirt on people who either are in the political class or might be interested in joining the political class. He gathers dirt and holds on to it so that when they're in a position of power, here shows the FBI or someone who has direct access to the FBI and threatens them.
Any change in that is going to require huge numbers of Americans to start standing up and saying, we don't care what you have on this person. If they're going to do that, that's more important to us than anything else. And if our members take away anything, if our listeners take away anything from this, you have to start convincing people that this bureaucratic state is the greatest danger to our country and our future that exists today, and we have to start doing something about it.
And here's something. This is worth an ongoing conversation. All of us here at the Vino and Veritas Society should be engaged in. We tend to attract, our organization tends to attract good people, patriotic people, people who love their country, who love freedom, who have respect for the Constitution, and so they tend, I think, I'm going to generalize about our members, but I think they admire people of virtue. They admire public political figures who seem to be good human beings, morally decent, virtuous, principled. We might be at a place where we have to start rethinking that. We might need to, we might need to be a little more Machiavellian in the way we're going to hit the administrative state and find people who are willing to fight and say, if this person will go after the bureaucratic class, he's going to go after them. He's not perfect, and they're going to come up with dirt on him. Guarantee it. And the only way this is going to work is if we say, we stand behind you no matter what dirt they throw up, because your job is not to demonstrate to us you're an angel. Your job is to get rid of that bureaucratic organization. Go after it like a pit bull. And then we need to support them through that until that work is done, and let the world see that you can actually get rid of a bureaucratic organization and the sun still comes up the next day, and the people you love are still there, right? And life goes on.
It's a really interesting conversation. I would love to hear from some of our members what they think. Can they get behind somebody who they generally don't like as a person,
right?
But they're willing to back them up no matter what. It's a really interesting.
It's a different context in some ways, but the principle is very similar. In the early 1940s, there after Churchill was elected prime minister, the single biggest problem England had on their hands was Germany. The Germans are bombing. They're bombing London. They're bombing English cities, and the Royal Air Force had dwindled down to almost nothing. What are you going to do? And Churchill's looking around the world, and he sees this guy Joseph Stalin, and Stalin says, "I will go punch those Germans so hard they won't know what hit them." And if you're Churchill, you're thinking, well, Stalin's not a good man at all. He's doing horrific things. Everything he represents, what he believes about the world might someday be the greatest threat to human life. But right here, right now, I need someone who will punch the Germans. And the Russians will punch the Germans. They'll do more than punch. I mean, they ended up losing just unimaginable numbers of soldiers fighting the Germans. But he made that. He allied with Stalin in a way you could say it was very Machiavellian, but in another way it was just the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. Otherwise you basically are committing suicide, because the English could not fend off the German war machine. They couldn't.
It's a really interesting comparison. I think it's a perfect place to leave it for this week. I'd love to hear from some of our members, see what they think of that, and what would they do in that situation, and what do they think we need to do in order to start fighting back against this very dangerous bureaucratic state that we're dealing with. But I think that's what we have to do in order to really stand up and defend the American idea, guard the American idea, the way we want this organization to do.
No sumos custodes, Dave.